I represent the rent is too damn high party. They can't eat breakfast, lunch, or dinner. Listen, someone's stomach, child's stomach just growled. Did you hear it? Gotta listen like me.
This is Openwork, a look inside the watch industry, a podcast from Collective Horology. I'm Gabe Riley, co-founder of Collective.
And I'm Asher Apkin, co-founder of Collective. Collective Horology is an independent watch retailer based in Southern California. We carry a wide range of independent brands, including Czapek, Archanaut, Singer Reimagined, and more. To learn more about us and check out our available inventory, visit collectivehorology.com.
Today on the podcast, we're taking a look at luxury pricing. Now, we've already done a deep dive on how watches are priced, and you can check that episode out with Mike Margolis of Czapek and Singer Reimagined. But we focus largely on how inputs like cost of labor, materials, inflation, and currency exchange impact pricing. But I think we all know there's more that goes on when it comes to pricing for watches and luxury goods more broadly. There are clearly considerations like brand, product positioning, and consumer psychology that impact pricing as well. And that's what we want to explore today, those more nebulous inputs into luxury and watch pricing.
And to help us with that, we have the perfect guest, Katharine Zarrella, who is a writer, editor, and the fashion critic at large at Document Journal. With a background as fashion director at the Wall Street Journal's off-duty section, and as a lecturer at Parsons School of Design and Central St. Martin's, she has contributed to numerous renowned publications, including Harper's Bazaar, The Business of Fashion, and most recently, The New York Times, where she published the guest essay, Obscene Prices, Declining Quality, Luxury is in a Death Spiral. And that is exactly why we wanted to have you on today. Katharine, welcome to Openwork.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
We are thrilled to have you. And that article, or I guess the New York Times technically calls it a guest essay. That guest essay, I'm sure touched quite a nerve in the sort of larger luxury industry and fashion in particular, which is mostly where you've focused, but it certainly resonated with watch enthusiasts and with folks in the watch industry as well. Pricing and price increases in particular that have surpassed inflation have been a hot topic, both on this podcast and in the watch community more broadly. So your article made the rounds of watch enthusiasts and, who knows whichever other kind of segments of the world it touched as well, but it certainly resonated with us. And we're thrilled to have you here because we really do want to have a candid conversation about how these companies, and keep in mind many of the same large luxury holding companies that you referenced in your article are also in the watch industry. And many of the executives and many of the strategies and playbooks that these companies run across not only their fashion brands and their other businesses, but in watches as well. So let's start with what motivated this essay, which I think you described as, you felt like it was something of a betrayal. So clearly something broke. And I'm just kind of curious, like what prompted this essay?
Well, I mean, I think first of all, there's been a lot of conversation among, fashion journalists and insiders for the last few years about these skyrocketing prices and the fact that quality isn't really, increasing at the same rate that the prices are increasing. And in fact, it's decreasing. But what really tipped the scales for me was when I bought a very expensive pair of Marc Jacobs boots that I was so excited about. It was the first pair of heels I bought after having a spinal fusion, which, I mean, that's on me. I probably shouldn't have done that. But they're very high. They're very fabulous. And they broke very, very, very quickly. I have never had anything break as quickly as these shoes. And, to be fair to Marc Jacobs, I've had a number of other pieces that I've invested in that just kind of fell apart just days after purchasing it or after a couple of wears, which should not happen when you're investing in luxury products. So that was kind of the last straw for me. And I think that there's not enough candid discussion about, pricing and also how things are made these days, particularly at fashion publications, since you rely on the advertisers and keeping them happy in order to keep your publication going. So I was very excited for the opportunity to talk about it.
So as listeners to this podcast know, because we brought it up before, but probably news to you, both my partner and I, before entering this business, came from advertising and marketing. And so much of what we thought of in that side of the world when we looked at luxury was based around this idea of brand building and brand equity. And that brand equity would carry a lot of the price premium that would ultimately be commanded by a luxury brand. And of course, inherent in the idea of brand equity is quality of product. And quality, generally speaking, one imagines, costs money. So I'm curious, when we look at things like costs of component and supply chain, we've talked about this in our side of the industry a lot about what goes into the fundamental pricing of the actual product, the craftsmen that make it, et cetera. But then there's this other side of it, which gets filled by this idea. And I'm curious your point of view on this, of brand equity, and that carries some degree of inherent value that maybe raises the price of something. So from the perspective that you have, can you talk a little bit about how a luxury house might consider these different elements, whether it's the power, quote unquote, of their brand, the cost of producing and maintaining their operations, et cetera, into pricing something, and where you think that inflection point tipped from something that was rational to something that now is irrational, where you're spending a ton of money on something which immediately fails you?
So, I think you're probably familiar with the old saying that you're paying for the label. And that's absolutely the case. I think that particularly over the last 10 years, brands have been relying on the power of their label or their brand name way too much and have been slacking on the quality. In my story, I talk a lot about Vuitton and Chanel and the kind of principles of their founders, and that the brands have largely abandoned the, dedication to quality and the principles that these people founded the brands on hundreds of years ago or 100 years ago, depending on what the brand is. And I mean, if you look at there's the story about the Dior bag where Dior was creating it for, I think, something like $57 in these sweatshops in Italy, and then selling it for, $2,500, the exact number in front of me, but somewhere thereabouts for a canvas bag. I mean, that's ridiculous. There's no reason that you should be, paying for that much of a markup. It's all about the margins and about, profits, which of course that's capitalism. That's, what these companies are meant to do. But I think as fashion has become, and luxury generally has become more and more corporate and controlled by these big holding companies, it's really become less about the principles of the brand and craftsmanship and more about just how much can you sell and, how do you build the brand even more?
Do you hear any feedback from within these corporations, from folks that in there, that demonstrates any frustration around this? I mean, we certainly understand, the reality of working under corporate overlords. We've been there for many years. And, driving shareholder value is what they do. But presumably, if, at least from our side of the world, if you're working in the watch industry, you're a designer, say, you still aspire to bring an excellent product to market. Now, you may get ground down by someone above you who says, sure, but we can do that for less, or that's extraneous, so that's not necessary, or just no. But presumably you come in bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. Are there still people that you're hearing within on the fashion side of the world that are trying to push against that? Or do you feel like the industry really is on a death march towards low quality, high product or high cost product?
I think that, it's not that the designers don't have the control over this. They could create something that is so beautiful and looks so great on the runway and, looks like a really special, brilliantly crafted piece. But when it's going to production, they're not going to want to pay for the holding companies aren't going to want to pay for the hand stitching, or, they're not going to want to pay for like this elevated fabric because the margin won't be as favorable. So I don't think that designers are to blame. And I think that a lot of designers at these houses really do pride themselves on craftsmanship and ingenuity and creativity and are earnestly trying to make great products. I think that they just don't have the power to do so. And I have spoken to people at brands that are incredibly frustrated. I was talking to someone at a French brand about how the fabrics had degraded exponentially since the designer passed away and the house had changed hands to a holding company. And they said, yeah, no, we know it's a huge problem and I don't really know what they're doing about it. And that was heartbreaking to me.
We've talked a lot about kind of some of those considerations that come from quote unquote corporate, right? So there are things about the price, the ultimate price or the pricing of something that are driven by factors that are outside the hand of the creator, whether that's a designer or a watchmaker or a product manager. And so those are things like currency exchange rates, like those are out of everyone's control. Those are things like the business decision makers of a granted luxury house deciding like they need to improve their margins or their profitability, and therefore the price needs to move up, whether or not quality has or hasn't. But then there are some of these other things that you mentioned in your essay, which I thought were really some of the things like no one ever talks about, which is this idea of a Veblen goods strategy. So pricing something high so it seems more desirable. Manufactured scarcity. So again, pricing something out of the market and creating this perception that is really desirable and really hard to get. One thing we've talked about on this podcast is price positioning. Well, my competitor, who I don't think as highly of, has priced an equivalent product at X. So therefore, we have permission, or we almost need to price our product at Y, price it higher, so that our position in the marketplace or in the mind of the consumer is higher. To what extent in the world of fashion or in your reporting have you uncovered and looked at some of those kind of softer, squishier, potentially more kind of psychological inputs to pricing? And are they overblown? Or is this really part of the discussion that's happening within fashion houses and luxury brands when they think about pricing? To what extent, I guess, do those things really drive pricing?
They drive them to a huge extent. I mean, if you look at Chanel, which was a big focus of my story, their famous 2.55 leather flat bag has gone up, exponentially in price over the last 10 years. I mean, I think it was 4,000 something back in 2013, and now it's $10,800 for the standard bag, and that's not including like special runway editions or like any additional frills, etc. And allegedly, part of that choice was because Chanel wanted to compete with Hermes, that has the iconic Birkin bag that sells for a bit more, but has always been more expensive, at least as long as I've worked in fashion, always been more expensive than the standard Chanel bag. And they wanted to be perceived as this really, they still want to be perceived as this very, very high-end brand that is on par with Hermes, which, in some cases, they very well may be. However, the craftsmanship of the Chanel bags that are made now, according to a lot of the clients that I spoke to, as well as some cobblers and leather experts that, spend their lives fixing these bags and have done it for the last 40 years, they've really, really gone down in quality. So you're paying a lot more money for a bag that's not as well made. And I mean, like, pay more, get less is the worst tagline ever. However, the perceived value of, being able to post yourself on Instagram with this fabulous bag that not everyone can afford because it's so outrageously, prohibitively expensive is worth it to a lot of people, even if the bag's not going to, hold up if you're walking around New York City.
But people still buy them. And this is, I think, where I get a little bit of a question mark over my head. The brands, they do this partially because they are able to still sell product at least currently, at these heightened prices. On our side of the market, there's definitely pushback. I mean, we see that from surveys that we've conducted and from client feedback that we just received personally. But it's not like these stores are filled with tumbleweeds. People are still purchasing. So when we talk about, like, you've mentioned the perspective of cobblers, of leather workers, of people who literally know the ins and outs of this. But when we turn this around to somebody who might be attracted to a Chanel bag or a Birkin, for example, and their knowledge of it is top line, so they know that Birkins, like I don't collect handbags, but I know what a Birkin is. So culturally, it connects me, but my knowledge of Hermes leatherworking is limited to the wallet that I have from them, and that's about it. And I don't have that extensive knowledge of how all that comes together. So I'm curious, like, do you find from a consumer perspective, aside from general frustration around price inflation in general, what has their response been to this? Are there consumers saying, I don't get it, I just spent however many thousands of dollars on this bag and it fell apart? It doesn't make sense to me because it's from Chanel? Or do you feel like there's a more informed audience now and they're starting, and that there's a pushback from that, or none of the above, and that we're screaming to the void?
It's a curious combination. So on the one hand, a lot of people are buying these pieces that are obscenely expensive for clout. They want to be able to show it off. It's conspicuous consumption. It's nothing new. And they frankly don't care enough about the craftsmanship. Like, they want the brand name. They want to be able to post that on Instagram or, Twitter or TikTok or wherever they're posting their images. There definitely are consumers who are really frustrated. And I interviewed a lot of them on Background, but they're still buying the bags. They're still shelling out for these pieces, even though they're falling apart. And then they take them to the, whatever brand to get repaired. And it takes a year, or they can't repair it, or, some other kind of ridiculousness. So there's a problem that the consumers will complain, but they still want that status. And in some cases, they just don't know where else to go, which is, perhaps a big failure on media's part of not informing people about independent craftsmen and emerging brands that, aren't massively produced and that can uphold that quality. Maybe it's not going to be as recognizable, which in my personal opinion is preferred. But, a lot of people aren't necessarily buying it for the quality. Like, if you're going to, Bergdorf Goodman and you're going on a shopping spree, nobody's inspecting the stitching when they're drinking champagne in the dressing room. It's not happening. So I think that it is part of the consumer's responsibility. And you are starting to see on various online platforms like Reddit, tons of complaints from consumers about the lack of quality of their, a bag that they saved up months and months to buy, that, the stitching started coming apart, and the exponential increase in prices that has almost nothing to do with inflation. So consumers are wisening up, and people are spending less on luxury. If you just look at the profits for a lot of these companies, they have not been exemplary in the last couple of quarters. But, at the end of the day, if you can afford a $10,000 bag and it's a drop in the hat for you, you're probably not going to care that much if the stitching is falling apart or if it was made in a sweatshop, which is unfortunate, but it's the reality.
It's interesting that you mentioned the financial health and the sales performance of large luxury houses. This is a topic we talk about quite a bit on this podcast. And generally what we're seeing is something similar in the watch industry. The publicly traded companies, whether it's LVMH or Swatch or Richemont, of course, disclose how much their watchmaking divisions are making and how they're doing. And the last few years have been really difficult and seen declines, largely driven by the industry coming off the highs of COVID in general, when there was sort of a spending spree, but also in particular in the last few years, a dramatic slowdown in China. So I think it would just be good to talk about where the large luxury houses are in general. What is the overall, so this obviously goes way beyond watches, but what is the current state of those large luxury houses, whether it's LVMH, Richemont, Kering Group, others? Like, generally speaking, how are their businesses doing? And how does the state of the industry and the state of their businesses contribute to pricing?
So, listen, there's tons of reporting about the downturn in profits for these big luxury conglomerates. However, they're still fine. Their owners are still some of the richest people in the entire world. They're not going to collapse at any time in the near future. And to be honest, these fashion brands get most of their profits from a $30 lipstick that they're selling. They're not banking on people spending $10,000 on a, t-shirt that, might have one hand stitch or something. I'm exaggerating, but that's not where their profits are coming from. So we can, lament the downfall of luxury all we want, but I think at the end of the day, these brands are going to be okay. Yes, because of what's going on in China and also, downturns in people investing in the States as well, there is a slowdown. And I'm sure that, the executives are nervous about that. But I don't think it's detrimental to these companies, and I don't think it's permanent.
In your guest essay, you mentioned, one of the reasons prices are increasing in some ways is to offset some of these losses or lower revenue. To what extent do you see that? And I guess, what are the long-term implications of a business that decides, oh, my revenue is softening, therefore I'm going to raise prices. Like, where does that go?
I mean, it doesn't go anywhere great. I think that, if the perception of a brand is that it's too accessible, it's mass market, anyone and their mother can buy it, Birkin bags at Walmart, what have you. It's not good for the brand. However, if they lower their prices to try to bring everything back down to earth and, get a grip and get their customers back, that looks even worse for the brand. And it's a real catch-22, because once you've raised your prices so much, if you go down, that's kind of like the kiss of death. It means that it's admitting to everyone that you're not selling, that your goods maybe aren't as valuable as you said that they were, as, people once thought that they were. And it's horrible for brand image. So I don't know the answer to what they can do to fix this other than make better products. But I don't see things getting less expensive anytime soon. I mean, you look at Burberry, who is actively lowering its prices, but how desirable is Burberry in comparison to Hermes or Chanel, to be honest? I mean, if you're buying the Birkin or the Chanel bag, you're not running to Burberry for a plaid scarf. Sorry, Burberry. But I think that's just the reality.
We've looked at this question too on our side, and one, I'll take a brand without naming names, but like a massive Swiss watch manufacturer that is owned by a holding company and has progressively increased their pricing, in some cases 20 to 25% from where they were about 4 years ago. And in doing so, they have now exceeded the limit of a customer's tolerability for that product. And two things have fundamentally happened there. One, the new product sits. So both retailers and their own boutiques have trouble moving it. And then the secondary market on it falls because desirability goes away, right? So the whole supply and demand reality plays out. And the only solution that came up in conversation was, well, the only way out of this is to introduce new product lines at more rational pricing, which of course takes years upon years to do in order to get that out the door. And then by the time you've done that, you don't even know what market you're going to be launching these things in. So the solution ultimately that we see from our side of the industry is we're just going to stick our head in the sand and do nothing. Because 4 years ago, it was a absolute, bull economy and things were selling without us having to do anything. Now it's rough, but who's to say in 4 years it won't be incredible again, taking away the once in a century pandemic reality of it. So that has driven a lot of people, and I want to come back to what you touched on a moment ago, to this world of independence. And in our space, I mean, obviously we're biased because we only sell independent artists ourselves, and we only cater to people who buy that. But there is a world, and we are not the only independent retailer that focuses just on that. So I'm curious, looking at those challenges and what we see from the large holding companies, can you talk a little bit about the ecosystem that supports independent makers in fashion? And, you mentioned like maybe there's a lack of coverage from the media standpoint, but how do collectors and folks in on your side of the industry discover new talent? And what is the corporate perspective on that talent? Because in our world, we do see these large holding companies sometimes try, like Chanel, for example, has recently been acquiring large stakes in major high-end independents. And I'm curious just to learn how that parallels or doesn't in the world of fashion, and if that's a good thing or not for both the brands and the consumer.
I'm quite literally writing a story about this right now.
Perfect.
So perfect. So it's not fantastic, the ecosystem for emerging brands and independent makers. I don't think that there is enough support for them. I think that the industry is getting a bit better at supporting them. But if you look at something like the LVMH prize, which is a prize for young designers, which in theory is amazing. But the first couple of designers who won, it was like the kiss of death. Like Thomas Tate, who was this amazing, amazing English designer, won the first LVMH prize. No one has heard from him in I don't know what happened to him. So that's happened to a couple of brands, like the first few brands that won. I think that not just the LVMH prize, but, young designer support schemes generally are getting a bit better, because if you rush a young brand or an independent brand that's really small, and then you put them under a microscope and blow them up and everybody wants news coverage and you're putting it on celebrities, they can't keep up with the demand, which ends up taking their business, because they can't, meet any kind of demand. They can't supply the pieces. They can't make things quickly enough. And, oftentimes these are intricate pieces that are not easy to make, and they don't have a huge, manufacturing powerhouse behind them. So it can be hugely harmful for the brands. But that said, we have things like the CFDA in New York for American fashion, and there's a scheme there.
What is the CFDA?
Oh, sorry, the Council of Fashion Designers of America.
Thank you.
And there is a CFDA Vogue Fashion Fund that supports young designers, which, helps. That definitely helps. But you still run the risk of, when your time in the spotlight's over and you're not getting the financial support, or like you run out of your prize money, where do you go from there? So I think that we need to be mentoring independent brands and young talents for a longer period than just throwing them in the spotlight and pushing them on and then letting them fall. Did that answer your question at all?
It does. And you probably were looking at my highly animated face while you were saying that, because the parallel is so strong. LVMH just recently started doing their own independent watchmaking. And within the watchmaking community, it was met with extreme derision and frustration, because the feeling essentially was, we poured our blood and sweat and tears. I mean, there's real blood equity in the businesses that we built and the art that we've made. And, Arno Alpha or Arno Beta is going to come in and basically going to just now take it and take it under the guise of, supporting the art form. And that, in fairness, is not a completely honest, assessment, because I do know that some of the Arnaults in particular do care massively about the art form, but they still represent a large holding company and everything that comes along with it. So this idea of, we're going to elevate these folks and we're going to support them, but in exchange for that, it's going to happen, de facto underneath the LVMH brand. You don't have to think too hard to imagine, what the next logical step would be if that brand continued to find success. And I think there's a lot of sort of nervousness about that, because of all the reasons that you went into, all the problems that we're seeing around quality control and price inflation, whatever, with large holding companies. But to your point, you also have these smaller makers that do want to be able to grow. They don't just want to be 1, 2, 3, 4 person watchmaking, companies forever, where they're, living hand to mouth and trying to make the bills get paid. So it sort of poses a kind of interesting question to me, which is, all right, well, we know what's wrong with the holding companies, and we know the challenges that these young artists, whatever the field that they work in, are facing. If we bright sky it for a minute, or rather blue sky it for a minute, what is the role of a giant holding company in a positive way? Like, if we look at this and say, we know all the things that they're doing wrong, and we see all the problems around price inflation, whatever, but is there a pivot that they can do where they're still making the buckets of money that they're making and elevating artists? Or is that just so far outside of the realm of reality that it's not even worth discussing?
I think they could absolutely do it. And even if they don't change the business practices for the big brands and they keep making those like big fat margins and what have you, I think that there is a way to consistently support young talent or independent makers that's more than just getting them a couple of magazine covers and doing a capsule collection and then pushing them aside. And I do think that, I know I'm talking a lot about LVMH, but that the LVMH prize and the way that they deal with mentorship, et cetera, has gotten a lot better. And I've heard that not just, from like bigwig executive people, but also from the young designers who were experiencing it. So I think that is a little silver lining, a light at the end of the tunnel, that they're, and perhaps that the prize was started with the best of intentions and you have to, go through some trial and error. But I do think that that's getting better. And I think that they're on the right track with that.
So the idea of cultivating talent from within the industry, I mean, aside from good intentions, which let's take that at face value and say, the companies who do this and want to foster and support young talent are doing it for the good of the industry overall and to support artisans and talented creative folks and all that stuff. It's also, like we were pointing out, if it works out, it can be a lever for growth, right? You find the next hot thing in whatever category it might be. One other lever for growth that the large holding companies have been pulling more and more, it seems, based on your reporting, has been licensing deals and finding ways to extend their current brands, their current maisons into new product segments, typically. And oftentimes that's meant going down market. So, maybe you're going from, I'm totally making this up, fine leather goods into designer sunglasses or whatever it might be. Can you talk about the way and the, I guess, the success or lack thereof that large holding companies have had with those brand extensions and with licensing? The reason I ask is it's actually in the last couple of years been a successful playbook in the watch industry. Probably the shining example of this is within the Swatch Group, where Omega and the Swatch brand teamed up to create Swatch, so plastic versions of Omega's most iconic watch, which is the Speedmaster watch. And that was hugely successful, not only from a commercial standpoint, but it did actually burnish the core Omega brand and the Omega Speedmaster product, and actually resulted in greater desirability for that product, improve value retention for that product on the secondary market. So it seemed to work well. But of course, when one thing works well in any industry, and the watch industry is no exception, you just do it again and again and again. And we have seen another Swatch collaboration under the Swatch Group with Blancpain and Swatch. I'm sure there will be others. So I guess the question is, what can the watch industry or the watch segment of the luxury industry, what does it need to be aware of and learn from the broader luxury industry when it comes to that trend of brand extensibility and licensing?
So you have a couple different facets of that. So you have licensing deals, you have collaborations, and then you also have diffusion brands. A big example is, in 1983, Roy Halston, I'm not sure if anyone saw the Netflix series, but he's a very, very famous designer, like big Studio 54 era, genius, was struggling. So he partnered with JCPenney, and that was it. Like the brand it was donezo. Like nobody wanted it anymore. It did not work out. However, you also have a lot of partnerships now with H&M, and you see big designers like even Comme des Garçons, which is one of my favorite brands, who are great at supporting young designers via Dover Street Market, actually. But really strategic partnerships, super, super limited edition that makes it accessible to those that might not actually be able to, buy a piece like regularly. It's not really in their normal rotation, and they're still not compromising their aesthetic. And these pieces actually become collector's items. So I think it has something to do a bit with scarcity and making it a cult moment. If you're doing a ton of it, I mean, that's just, you're just going to end up like a punchline. Like I feel like Armani Exchange is like a punchline. It's not super comfortable. It's like, well, you're not going to Armani. You're going to go to Armani Exchange. You get these terrible jeans. I'm going to get kicked out of fashion. But, I think it's about being incredibly strategic. It's about doing things intentionally and slowly and picking and choosing what you're going to do. If you do too much of it, you just become a down market brand, and that's the end of the game.
You brought up Dover Street Market, which does have some crossover into watches, and just in my limited experience of menswear too, has also been a place of discovery. In fact, I think I probably came across like Visvim for the very first time at Dover Street Market like 15 or 16 years ago.
What is Dover Street Market for the uninitiated?
I will tell you all about Dover Street Market. So Dover Street Market is it's effectively a kind of niche department store that was founded by Rei Kawakubo, who is a famous Japanese designer of Comme des Garçons, which is kind of this revolutionary brand that stormed into Paris in I believe it was the kind of like early mid 80s, although the brand existed before then. And there was a big influx of Asian designers that were kind of changing the way that people thought about fashion. And Rei Kawakubo was one of these designers. She had a huge exhibition at the Met in, I believe, 2017. And it was one of the first, like very few Met exhibitions dedicated to a single designer. So they being Dover Street Market, which is run by her and her husband, Adrian Joffe, support a lot of independent brands and young talents. Like, yes, they have, the Gucci's or, the bigger brands that we all know of, but they're very selective on, or Margiela, for example, but they're very selective on what they include. And they're huge on supporting young brands, not just by selling them, but also with manufacturing. They have a showroom that takes place during Paris Fashion Week that gets editors to come meet these young designers, which is huge for them. It's kind of, if you get into the Dover Street showroom, you are in a much better place than most up and coming talents in the industry.
So the Dover Street thing I found fascinating because, Gabe, if you've never been in one, it's not only is it a unusually laid out store relative to you mentioned Bergdorf earlier, like one feels very old world and expensive and one feels very, avant-garde and below 14th Street, as it were, for the handful of people that know what I mean. But it's also still a heightened experience. And to me, if we come back around to value, there is that other side of it, which is there's the value of the good itself, how well it's made, the design, the artistic component of it. There's the brand. And then there's this third component, which we haven't really touched on yet, which is experience. And I think, what luxury means to someone is obviously highly subjective. And, we talk about it one way, our competitors talk about it another. But I'm curious, when we think about value, and I don't mean like low prices, but I mean the value of a good, can we talk a little bit about how experience fits into that? Because if I'm going back again to when I was in my 20s and I had a little bit of money to spend on this stuff and I liked menswear and I was in shape and I wanted that stuff, and I went to Dover Street Market and I had two interesting experiences in there. One, I discovered makers I did not know. And two, I had incredibly knowledgeable sales staff there that were able to talk to me about what made that so special and interesting and right for me or not right for me. And that was a luxurious experience, which is, not the same transactional one that I thought I saw elsewhere. And there's value in that. So I'm curious, when you think about if we go back to that pricing conversation, putting aside the other two areas we've talked about, can we talk a little bit about experience? And have you found that as these prices have increased, that the experience of acquiring these products has gotten better or worse, and what goes into that, and if that should be a function of the pricing of something?
It depends on where you go, but the experience by and large has gotten a lot worse. I mean, Dover Street Market and these other kind of niche retailers are the exception. I mean, there's been tons of magazine features on the Dover Street staff because they wear crazy things and they are super knowledgeable. They're not in like the black suit and, walking around just kind of ignoring everyone until you see somebody who looks like you're going to get a big commission out of them. But, by and large, I spoke to someone who is a huge bag collector, a really, really big luxury client. And he had a horrible, horrible experience with an extremely expensive bag that she bought. It immediately broke and then nobody would help her, or let her know what was going on. So she brought the bag back to the store and she sent me months and months of email exchanges, which was just the most negative experience, which with a brand that, should be absolutely pandering to, the people that are spending so much on these pieces. And I think that that's kind of the norm these days. It's, there's obviously exceptions to the rule at any store, at any brand, but I think that by and large, the customers are not getting the luxury experience that they crave when they go to a luxury store. I wrote in my story that now these big, massive luxury, stores on Fifth Avenue, say, are kind of just tourist destinations. No one's really going in to have an experience. And I mean, they are going to have an experience, but not that luxury experience. They're going in to take a picture for Instagram and buy a keychain. And I think that that's the bulk of the kind of luxury shopping experiences these days.
Yeah. And I think that that feeds into what we were talking about, which is like the luxury industry from a business standpoint is in a pickle now. There were some really good years during COVID, and now we're in this cooling off phase. And look, above all industries, the luxury industry is a cyclical industry. It's boomed and it's busted before. One of the things you pointed out was this is actually a pretty tough phase for large luxury brands and houses. And in fact, many haven't seen the challenges the financial challenges in terms of revenue and sales. They haven't seen this kind of market since maybe 2008. Like, it's been a while since the industries really had to go through a reckoning. Now, a reckoning can be a great thing and lead to some goodness, and we'll talk about that. But I guess, you expressed the confidence that, like, look, these are very well capitalized companies, owned or controlled in many cases by some people with very deep pockets. But like, aside from, one option is like, let's raise prices. Another is let's go down market or, do these licensing deals or try to find new talent. Like, you have confidence that a lot of these players will be just fine. But like, what do they do to manage difficult periods in their businesses? Like, what are some of the headlines we might expect to see next in terms of how the holding companies are managing these periods? What sort of playbooks do you expect them to return to, or maybe do you hope that they'll try as they look to move toward the next cycle of luxury, which will hopefully be an upswing?
I think at the very least, they need to rehabilitate their reputation and kind of image, if you will. So, I mean, the Dior sweatshop handbag situation was a headline that did not go away. And I mean, yes, people are still buying Dior, and I don't know that I hate to say anybody, but I think a lot of the people who own that bag aren't that fussed by it. But it's not great for consumer confidence or, for bringing in new consumers or for brand image. So I think that some of these brands, I would hope, would take a page out of Hermès's playbook. And Hermès is kind of and I wrote a lot about this, the exception, to this rule, because they do not bring in, a bunch of like corporate nonsense. Like, they are sticking with the artisans that they train in schools around France. And they really, really try to uphold these same standards that the brand was founded upon. And I'd love to see other brands go in that direction. And I think that would really instill a lot more consumer confidence, and it would make people eager to invest in these brands because you're investing in a story, you're investing in, an artisan who made this piece. And I think that's something that, it's also good press if you do that, right? Like, people want headlines about, we're working with all of these artisans, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that you're going to start seeing more of that and more of these special, like, we worked, hand in hand with this individual to create this piece. And whether or not it's true is a whole different conversation. I'm not saying like it is true at Hermès, but oftentimes brands will say like, oh, like, we did this thing and it's so amazing. But it's kind of like, I was watching your podcast from about being made in China, and it's like, well, the whole shoe's made in China except that the sole's stitched on in Italy, so you can still say it's made in Italy. So some of it is smoke and mirrors, but I think you're going to see a lot more storytelling from these big brands that make them look like they care.
What about consolidation? So this was something that came up in our last podcast. We did 2025 predictions, and in 12 months, we'll see just how wrong we were. But one of the things we talked about was like the many stages of grief in the watch industry. And the first stage of grief is you start to rationalize supply. So at least in the watch industry, we're seeing, fortunately, this has not happened in the past, but we're seeing that the large companies aren't really flooding the market with too much supply. So supply has come down along with sales. And what that shows up as in the secondary market is we're seeing the level of supply in the secondary market, so the market for used watches, kind of hold steady, which is encouraging. It's like our answer to this problem isn't to produce more stuff that doesn't find a home. Okay, so that's the first stage of grief. We recognize we need to adjust production. The second stage of grief is like we see fewer retailers. So there's been a massive consolidation of retailers in the watch space. We've talked a lot about this on past podcasts, both in new and pre-owned watches. The third and final stage of grief here, which is the most difficult step to take, is consolidating the number of brands, because no one makes a decision to close a brand lightly for any number of reasons. But we've seen
or sell it.
Or sell it. Yes, exactly. So one example would be the Kering Group. They got rid of their watch brands. They spun them off. So Ulysse Nardin and Gerard Perregaux, which were part of that group for a while, were spun off. They were actually sold to the executives of those companies, which is a whole nother juicy topic we can get into. We're predicting we're going to see more of that. In other words, we'll see ultimately fewer watch brands, because when you navigate a period of decline, some things like lack of demand or declining quality end up kind of catching up with you, and you got to close your doors or move on from a brand if you're a large holding company. Is that something you see happening in the luxury industry more broadly? Does that typically happen in these cycles? Are there rumors and musings in the industry of consolidation or brands closing or getting spun off? Like, how do you see that unfolding in the industry more broadly?
I don't see that happening. I wish it would happen. There are way too many fashion brands, and oftentimes they are not doing service to what the brand once was. So maybe a house that was founded 100 years ago by this incredible designer, now it's just absolute trash garbage that they're producing. And the designer's rolling in his grave. That happens so frequently. And I'd rather just see them shut it down. Just shut it down. Call it a day and focus your resources on the brands that, you're employing a bunch of people. You can make amazing things instead of a bunch of garbage from all of these tiny brands that half the world doesn't have any idea what they are. There are objectively just too many brands. There's too much product. You're seeing a lot of stuff end up at, I was going to say consignment stores, which is also true. The secondhand market is ridiculous. Like if you go on the real, it's like, where is all this stuff coming from? Who is buying this and who's selling it? It's incredibly confusing. You'll see 95 of the same, Gucci bag, and it's really, really shocking and upsetting. But I think that the production at the very least needs to go down. Too much stuff's being produced. I mean, fashion brands used to burn, and I'm not sure if some still do this, but I know they just outlawed it in Europe. They used to burn their excess stock to create scarcity because they would rather set it on fire than give it to a discount retailer. And that's wild. So I would really hope that they would start making fewer things, and, in the reality that is going to up the demand for it, or the desire for it, at least.
Yeah, it's interesting. In our side of the business, it's sort of there's a crossroads there. We have examples, as we saw with Cartier, for example, which had overproduced dramatically about a decade ago and ultimately bought back all of their inventory from their retailers and essentially destroyed all of it and then started from scratch, which was something to the effect of like a half or a little bit over $500 million write-off, or write-down rather, for the company that they swallowed in order to get Cartier back to the position that it's in the market now. The other side that we also see is this ostrich approach of saying, well, my customer is the retailer, and it's the retailer's responsibility to place these goods. So I'm going to keep raising my prices to the retailer, my wholesale price, and they're going to find homes for it. Like, of course, wink, wink. But to your point, the parallel of the 90 Gucci bags appearing online is paralleled in our industry, with hundreds upon hundreds of watches from certain makers being made available at below wholesale costs on third-party sites, because their product is being rammed down their throat at increased wholesale pricing. And what we see in those scenarios, Cartier I'm not always the kindest to holding companies on this podcast, but due respect to Richemont for eating it on that one, because they really did turn that business around, and they did something that most companies don't do. They took a near-term brutal loss for a long-term potential gain. And that proved to be the right move. It isn't what we generally see right now, where we do see, Gabe did point out, there has been a right size in production, but not from everybody. And some of their solutions are just that. And that has the impact of destroying brand equity. Because to your point, if I go into the store when someone tells me that this bag is super rare and they don't realize that, I have the internet and like a very basic, search will tell me that that's just not true, then your brand equity is going to be brutalized. So, I'd love to come back around to a positive, which is Hermes, because Hermes is this business that sits in our world. They have they've done a tremendous amount of work and investment in high quality watch design and production over the last, what's it been, like about 20 years of like serious watch work from Hermes?
I'm not an Hermes expert, except to say their watches are really excellent.
Yeah. And without spinning off into why we like them, they're great pieces. But they do exemplify a lot of the ethos that you touched on. But the weird thing to me about Hermes is that they walk this fine line. Because on the one hand, there's the Hermes that you're talking about, right? Which is the super high end, ultra, very specified allocation Birkin business. And to a lesser degree, their haute horology division as well. But then there's all the Hermes franchises that exist in every airport that all of us walk through all the time. And yet that hasn't diminished their brand equity at all. So they have these franchised mass market appeal, yet somehow they still are controlling their inventory to maintain some degree of demand. They make a ton of money. They're highly profitable. They do this by employing, to your point, highly skilled laborers in very expensive markets. So in many ways, they're still exemplifying so much of what make luxury. High quality experience, high quality product, limited to a degree, availability, and you pay for, you get what you pay for. If that is profitable and that model works, just like with Cartier, if that was the right move and that model works, why do you think so many of these companies ignore that and instead walk the other direction?
I ask that question a lot, and I honestly think that part of it is they're bringing in too many corporate consultants and not paying attention to, what the brand is all about.
So McKinsey really is the problem for everybody.
Yeah. I mean, that's what I think that people they're looking at it like a, I don't know, some kind of like massive manufacturer instead of like a luxury brand. They're not treating their luxury brands like luxury brands, and they're not thinking about them like luxury brands. They're thinking about them like mass brands that have to make the most amount of money. And in reality, all they're doing by thinking that way is making their brands less valuable, less desirable, less special. And I think that that's really, really detrimental. I mean, Hermes said no to all of that. And there is a balance. Like they've struck that kind of sweet spot where, yes, they have the, perfume or, this scarf that's more accessible. However, they're not letting it spill over into their super luxury goods. I think where you see a lot of these other brands, the problem is that the like poor quality of, the keychain or, a plastic pair of sunglasses or what have you is now being reflected in their most expensive pieces. There's no division there. And it's no secret, again, that luxury brands make most of their money off of the smaller pieces, the beauty, the sunglasses, the accessories, etc. But, and there's no shame in that game. Absolutely not. But once that starts to spill over into their high-end products and they're not made as if they're high-end products anymore, that's a brand killer.
Yeah, I mean, I would argue that even if the keychain or the pair of sunglasses isn't all that great, that's a brand killer because you've undermined your brand before you've even really started with a customer, right? So let's say I am the person who goes, to visit New York and I'm on Fifth Avenue and I want to take a picture in whatever store on Fifth Avenue and I maybe walk out with a pair of sunglasses. And then they fall apart a couple of months later. Well, is that brand I just bought those sunglasses from really the end all be all? And I might just kind of write them off or figure like I can buy a pair of sunglasses that will fall apart in a matter of months on the internet for $20. Why do I need this brand? So I think regardless of the price point, your product quality has to back it up. I mean, part of what a brand is a promise to the customer. Right? Part of the reason why that pair of sunglasses or that keychain might be really expensive is because of its quality, or if there's an issue, it will be resolved right away. And the moment you sort of break or burst the perception of that promise, you're done. That's it.
I think you're absolutely right. And, I want to be clear that I think the the kind of beauty of Hermes is even those entry-level products, they feel really luxurious. Like if you look at their lipstick or their nail polish, it's still accessible. It's more accessible than a Birkin bag for sure. And you're buying into the dream of Hermes, et cetera. It's like why Chanel is an haute couture show, because the people are buying the lipstick because they're buying into the dream of the haute couture show. But even those entry-level products, they're still luxurious. So I'm not saying that they're made like crapola and then, they go and have like a full different luxury sector. I think what I was trying to express is that the whole operation is, not from Hermes, but for some of these other brands is reflecting this kind of just lack of commitment to quality and lack of pride in what's being put forth, if that makes sense.
Totally.
It does. And before we wrap, I'd love to get your advice and, as you speak to an audience of collectors, how would you advise these folks, whether you're, whether they're into fashion or bags or menswear or watches? How would you advise somebody to vote with their feet in their wallet or something else to take some degree of agency here? Because one thing that's interesting is that, we talk a lot about in the world of independent watches, when you buy an independent watch, it really is patronage, because you are making it possible for that maker to exist, and you're making it possible for the makers behind them, for the watchmakers coming up to say, maybe it's possible for this. Maybe I really can do this. But those people, those patrons in every art form, the patrons have been critical at every era for hundreds of years in supporting artists. So what can collectors do to make a positive impact and change and shift away from this feeling that this is a thing that's being done to me or happening to me? What can they do?
Buy less and buy better. If something is objectively bad or poorly made, obviously poorly made, don't buy another one. Don't post it on Instagram. Don't tweet about it and say, I'm so fabulous. Like, look at me with this, bag that actually the stitching's falling apart, but you can't see it on Instagram. So it's fine because everyone thinks I'm fabulous. Just cut it out. And it really is on the consumer as well. The consumer needs to stop enabling this. The consumer needs to focus on, if you have the ability to spend that much money on something, spend it on something that's worth that much money. And then you understand the production practices, that where it comes from. Just do your research also. Don't just buy blind.
Can I push you a little bit on that?
Please.
So the power of brand is very intoxicating. And when we talk about someone saying, it's one thing to say, yes, of course, I'd love to go out and buy the thing that exemplifies the art form that I'm investing in. But of course, that's only one reason some people buy and collect. Status and peacocking and all of that is tied up in it too. So lesser product from status-oriented brands still provides a dopamine hit that may not come from a better product from an unknown artist. So have you seen anything on your, in your travels through the world that have moved people away from the sort of the dopamine of the expensive product, or pardon me, the famous product, to the pride in the quality product?
I think that if you're talking about an actual collector, someone who is really investing a lot of money in their fashion collection, their bag collection, what have you, it's not just about they don't want the same bag that everyone has that's really, really expensive. They're looking for really, really special pieces. And I think that oftentimes the people who are buying these not wonderfully made products, that it's, there's this term like mass luxury. I think that's a huge part of the problem. The actual collector is looking for rare, special pieces that no one else actually has. They're already moving away from those obvious things. And if they are going to buy one of these, like very obvious handbags that everyone seems to have at this point because the second, hand market is flooded and what have you, they're going to buy the first edition ever of that bag, or they're going to buy, the special limited edition that came out in 1982. That's what the collectors are really, really doing. Otherwise, I really do think it's just conspicuous consumption, and that I really, really encourage, even if you do want to flash stuff around and be in fancy pants and post it on Instagram, do some research, and you can still get the dopamine hit by buying a wonderful product, or just go to therapy. And I think that
cheaper
would help.
than a handbag. Well, I think it's Asher. That was a good challenge. The idea of like brands are intoxicating, status is intoxicating. I think that's a good note to leave it on, which is so too is being a collector. So too is being discerning. So too is if you know, you know. That is intoxicating as well. And so I think it just requires that we move the cheese on ourselves a little bit and try to find other joys in collecting rather than just consuming. Thank you for joining and sharing your insight and expertise. We appreciate it greatly.
Well, thank you for having me. I had a lot of fun. This was great.
Well, Asher, we haven't done this in a while, which is to say we haven't debriefed an episode or an interview we've done in quite a while. I mean, usually they kind of speak for themselves, but I think, this conversation wasn't really strictly about watches. It was about luxury more broadly. And I think it's worth tying some things back to watches. And in particular, one of the things that struck me, and Katharine mentioned, like, this was the whole reason for her writing that guest essay in the New York Times, was not only had pricing just gotten out of control, not only had pricing fatigue really set in for her in the broader luxury industry or in the fashion industry, but when it was met with a lack of quality, that's real. I mean, the Marc Jacobs shoe is really what set her off, which is a horrifying story considering what she was recovering from health-wise. And I don't know. I mean, to be fair to the watch industry, I just don't see the same issue with quality. In fact, while we can certainly say there's real fatigue around prices and price increases are a real thing, I don't know that people are really complaining and enthusiasts are really complaining about quality. Overall, I would say quality keeps getting better. When you look at year after year what's being offered, what's being released at Watches and Wonders, it's more watches with micro adjustment, more watches with longer power reserve, more watches with greater accuracy, more watches with interesting and innovative case materials, finishing, or even, to speak of durability, watches that are more durable and can withstand more. So I just don't know that we're seeing that same issue.
Well, I don't know that it's a direct parallel. And I would say that for us, it's more of a homogeneity of supply chain and less of a
interesting.
And less of a like quality thing, right? Like, I don't know that there is a watch brand out there that is doing the equivalent of what she was referring to with the Gucci bag and like somehow, creating a parallel supply chain of underpriced labor and the rest of it. But what I do think the industry has been dealing with has been homogeneity of supply chain, where this feeling of, and we see this all the time when we meet with clients where we're like, oh, we know exactly who made that bracelet, or we know exactly who made that clasp, or that quick release, or, XYZ, or from there. And I do think that does feed in a little bit to someone saying like, wait a minute here. Why am I paying this, X for this and then X time, X plus 7, X plus 8 for that? It's the same component. I don't get it. It's not that the component's bad. It's just I don't understand what the tax is that I'm paying in this scenario.
That's a great point that I hadn't considered at all.
Well, the other thing that struck me, and this is, separate from the business side of it, but I think it's something it makes me really happy, to be honest with you. It's just a reminder that, like, we focus so much on this part of the world because this is what we do for a living. And if you're listening to this podcast about the watch business, like, this is something you care deeply about, And it's just sometimes, just speaking personally, like, I've always been a little intimidated by fashion, because I think part of it is because people who I've known in the world of fashion exude some degree of confidence, because so much of the way that art form manifests is through the way somebody presents.
Yeah, it's a costume.
Yeah, literally. And it's just a reminder that, like, we're all nerds.
Oh yeah, when Katharine mentioned she collects clothing, or whatever you would call, there's probably some less pedestrian word for clothing, but when she's a collector of fashion stuff, I was like,
fashion stuff.
Yeah. I mean, people collect all sorts of things that make sense. And if you really admire a designer or a craftsperson or the way something looks or is made, like, of course you could collect it.
Yeah, exactly. And, she talked a little about hand stitching and like I have a very minor understanding of menswear and things of that. But I do remember the very first time that I gave any thought to, how clothing drapes or how an article of clothing is constructed or something to that effect, and like what goes into that. And how interesting that became, and the intimidation falls away, and you realize in the end, whether you love watches or, if you love sculpture or if you love, X, Y, or Z, it comes from a place of passion. And I think this is something that really resonates with me, both in the business that we're building and in the collectors that we encounter every day, which is all of this is about some degree of self-expression and championing somebody's emotional expression. Watches at their core. Why do we resent a watch that we feel is sterile? It's because it has no soul, right? There's nothing expressive about it. But when we see a watch that has soul, even if it's flawed, then it's a really beautiful thing, and we flock to it. We love it, and that was a really and this really, I think, connects to our questions around risk taking and how that will impact the business moving forward, because we talk a lot of price inflation, lowering cost of supply chain, blah, da, 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 da. In the end, if we really believe in this art form, then the risk taking at every level of the industry, from the largest production down to the individual watchmaker, from the Rolexes to the Haldemans of the world, is really the heart and soul of this. And that is what I take away from this conversation, which is, if we really, chasing after brand and saying your mass produced product is too expensive is a fool's errand. I recognize this. But what we can also choose to do is look around us and say, I'd rather just have this thing that is expressive, that is special, that is unique, that is not perfect, that maybe nobody else will recognize, that doesn't come with all of the social cachet and the free golfing trips and whatever. I'd rather just have the art for the art's sake. And I found that so inspirational. And I don't know, I'd rather sort of take away from this that than like luxuries on a death march.
Yeah. And look, I think the biggest aha for me was you put your finger on it, which is like, let's be honest with ourselves. A large reason people buy anything in this category, in this industry, luxury industry overall, is about brand and status. And that's a very rewarding, at least as far as like the dopamine goes, that can be a very rewarding motivator for purchase. And it can be a very rewarding feeling when you have
it's not
the
a bad thing. I mean, look, I have a Louis Vuitton wallet that I've carried in my pocket every day for 3 years since I bought it. It's held up. It's a great wallet. And I
enjoyed a little
buying
thrill
it
every time you see the Louis Vuitton logo or word mark on there?
Of course there is.
But so like, look, that's valid. And like, if we're going to buy these things that are essentially useless, that no one really needs, we should get some level of
well, ironically, that is a thing that I do use.
Well, sure, we should get some, but you could buy like I could make you a duct tape wallet in 15 minutes. But look, we should get some kind of joy or satisfaction out of it. But I like the idea of sort of accepting that premise. Like, yeah, we should get some joy or satisfaction out of this. And so maybe the mindset to have is less the mindset of a consumer, which is I want this brand, to the shift in mindset of a collector, which is I really want or I really value this thing because, and it gives me joy. And that could be, to your point, from an independent watchmaker or an artisan or a craftsperson. But you could really love a Grand Seiko 9F quartz watch because as a collector, as someone who gets joy from an object, you could love the dial finishing or that 9F quartz movement or its historical connections to other Seiko and Grand Seiko. The point is, that could be true of a Rolex or an Omega as well. But I do love the idea of like asking yourself, am I being a collector or a consumer? Yeah.
And I'll leave you with a perfect example of this that is topical as of today because it was announced yesterday, but hopefully still will be in 2 weeks, which is the Toledano and Chan V2, or the one, I think it's the 1.2 is what they called it. The variant on that brutalist watch that was released last year. And I saw a conversation in a group that we're in that really gave me a lot of joy. because it spun out initially into like, yeah, is it really worth it? Like, what's the movement? Like, it's made in China. All of the tropes that we're used to hearing about why something shouldn't cost what it cost. And then the people who were having that conversation took a step back and said, well, actually, wait a minute. Are we thinking about this the right way? Like, are we even looking at this watch as a watch?
Do I like the watch?
Yeah. Like, hold on a second. And it took a different turn, and the turn became about the idea and the materials and the thoughtfulness of it. And one person even said, and I mean, this person is like very much speaking to my heart, you know, what's the movement? Actually, who cares? Exactly. And that to me is so heartening, coming out of years of, you know, I mean, let's face it, like a lot of negativity and conversation, to see some people saying, I'm going to respond to a pricing question by asking not, is it worth it, but do I like it?
And do I find value in it?
Yes. And then you can ask the question of, in her case, you know, how is it made? Where is it made? What are the materials? In our case, who is the artisan? What is the process? And how did it come together? And then make a decision yourself about whether it's worth it, but evaluating it on its artistic merits first versus the sum of its parts. And I find that to be so exciting and a really fascinating way to approach mass market and independent watches.
All right. Well, shall we leave it there?
Yeah, I mean, I was unusually positive, so I think we should leave it there.
All right. Well, we will, and thank you for listening. Openwork is a production of Collective Horology. You can find us online at collectivehorology.com, and you can find our guest, Katharine Zarrella, online at katharineKZarrella.com and on Instagram at lady_KKZ. To get in touch with your questions, your feedback, or suggestions, just email podcast@collectivehorology.com.
As a karate expert, I will not talk about anyone up here because our children can't afford to live anywhere. Nowhere. There's nowhere to go. Once again, why? You said it, the rent is too damn high.